Hi, welcome to Powers. Panic is not a strategy. It's great to have you all return. Today we've been talking about how do you maximize your business performance during the coronavirus era. If you've been joining us for our entire three-part series, part one we talked about how do you reduce costs quickly and efficiently, and how do you take that strategic costs and get those reductions now for it. Phase two, we started talking about how do you help your leaders lead. What are the top supervisory skills you need to maximize employee performance? And today we're going to be talking about part three, which is coaching through a crisis. So how do we actually motivate and boost the morale of our employees through the midst of uncertainty and fear? I'm Sean Hart with Powers.
And I'm Dante Vaughn. And for our learning objectives today, as Sean mentioned, it's all about how to motivate employees in the midst of uncertainty and fear. And as part of that, we address three key areas. First, what we call empathy protocols. How do we take a look at the policies, the standard operating procedures, the things that have been put in place that are paramount to our business, and review them in a manner that ensures we're considering some of the work or life challenges that our employees may be facing in the midst of the coronavirus era. We're also going to talk about top 10 no-cost and low-cost company initiatives to boost employee morale, because what we find is many companies believe that you must throw a lot of money at morale, but there are some best practices that we can apply that really have an impact on the employee experience. And then we're going to wrap up with best practices to increase productivity by way of leadership engagement. And I want to encourage you to interject, ask questions throughout our webinar. That's what we're here for, to have a live and interactive experience. We also received a list of questions following our previous webinar that we want to be sure we address as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get started. Sean, when we talk about how to apply empathy protocols, I think it's important for us to define, well, what do we mean by empathy protocols? Does this mean we just throw all of our policies out the door in the midst of the corona crisis? Right? And on the contrary, empathy protocols really refer to those amendments applied to those standard operating procedures or policies that address unforeseen operational or other personnel challenges, and typically a result of external factors or external events, such as a pandemic or a major event that's impacting how we serve our customers. But when you think about empathy protocols, you typically focus on three key areas of your business: your policies and procedures as they relate to attendance, policies and procedures as they relate to performance expectations, and then those standards around safety that you want to consider as we look at responding to challenges in the workplace. So when we talk about empathy protocols, I think it's important to recognize that the need for empathy protocols really relates to maintaining an environment of flexibility in terms of how you operate. Without considering those flexible protocols, you begin to have some challenges that further complicate how you intend to run your business. And when I think about that, first thing that comes to mind is increased attrition as a result of some of the policies. Can you think of some policies that a company should consider in the midst of challenges or crises like what we face?
Yeah, I think when you really think about it and you start talking about policies and procedures that we have the organization, chaos starts to allow flexibility in those, right? Where we start to really try to understand, okay, what is it, say if it was attrition problem, right?
Yeah.
Or we don't have enough employees showing up for work,
Yes.
okay? We've got a large amount of absenteeism.
Yes.
What are we going to do and how are we going to flex our current policies now to ensure that we're going to be able to have those folks continue to attend? We're not going to put, say, additional stress on them, and frustrations on them. Like, so if they're 5 minutes late, are they going to get docked a point because they're 5 minutes late now?
Sure.
Even though those are the folks coming in and diving in the trenches with you,
Right.
trying to get dirty, and there's, 3 or 4 people that don't have the ability to show up to work anymore.
Sure.
So when you start thinking about, policies and procedures that you have to let up on, you really have to navigate that and use your HR team and construct with them quickly on what are we going to do? What are the protocols that we're going to put in place? What do we go ahead and effectively communicate on the out front, right? And when I say out front, like before our employees start walking through the door and they start to see these things, like if it's absenteeism, I'm going to get docked a point. Before that even occurs, what are we going to go ahead and communicate to our employees that, hey, you may see it pop up in your Chronos system that you got docked a point, but we want to let you know that we're actually waiving that right now. Or maybe we're extending the time of what that is. Maybe, you were considered late if you were 5 minutes late. Maybe it's now 8-9 minutes late, right? I think what happens is, the good thing about empathy protocols is you can be too stringent on them, right? When we talk about stringent, it's, that I'm going to stick to, the status quo where it's, you're here at 7 o'clock, you're not going to leave. You're not going to get here any later than 7 o'clock, and if you are, then you'll be docked those points, or there would be some type of negative action that occurs from that, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, so you need to start really understanding how you're going to start to flex your organization. Now, attendance is an easy one, right? I mean, everybody would shoot to that first, but what happens when you start talking about donning or doffing requirements, right? We have some clients that they actually have to get PPE on. Okay?
Yes.
I mean, think about in our medical device clients, right? I mean, they're in full suits,
Exactly.
like Tyvek suits, gloves, everything. But then they're also still required to start up the line at the same exact time every day. But the donning and doffing requirements now, they may have they got additional sleeves they have to put on now. They have head covers that they have to put on now that requires them to actually, it requires them more time to get set up. I think about our food and beverage clients, right? I mean, most of these guys would come in and their attire or their uniform was either a smock, right? Maybe a smock and gloves,
Sure.
okay? Some areas smock, glove, sleeves, right?
Sure.
But now you're talking about smock, gloves, sleeves, hair nets,
face
face
masks.
guards, face shields.
Sure.
You're talking about pant links, you're talking about the right amount of right shoes requirements that they have to put on, and all of that trying to be sanitary at the same point where every 30 minutes now maybe they're asked to be going to a boot wash, have to wash their hands. So you have to start flexing not only the policies that you have around, just standard PPE, absenteeism, which is more HR related field, but then you also have to start figuring out how is that going to start flexing me in the performance of my operations.
Sure. When I think about that, I mean, of course, there are standards of performance that we have for our employees. And in many cases, the lack of individuals on the line shouldn't change my personal performance expectation. But what happens if I'm asking them to be flexible and take on tasks that aren't in the scope of their normal performance? Should I be required to maintain the same rate of productivity in that circumstance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, it depends, right? I mean, so, when you talk about like our food and beverage clients, right now, their demand is so high that you need the highest level of productivity you can get right now. For some of the other industries, say in our construction and building clients, they've actually slowed down, right? So their requirements have changed. When you start talking about productivity, though, if I'm still required to do 1,000 units per hour and that required 5 people to do that, right? And now I'm saying that I'm only going to have 3 people there, right? The productivity, my numerator and denominator, still does not change. Okay? I'm still requiring the same units per labor hour that I need. Now, the volume in which I actually get, or the throughput which I get out, will change. So now, I've got the 2 targets. I have my performance target, which I'm measuring on, and then I have to also watch the volume coming through. So as long as I'm hitting my performance targets, I still have to make sure that I engage our employees out on the floor and just letting them know that, the requirements of volume, throughput that we're pushing through the line has changed, but the productivity on that new volume hasn't changed.
Hence the importance around communication. And ideally proactive communication around that performance. When I think about how do I apply an empathy protocol, what I used to celebrate as a performance threshold or milestone for my employee may have to change now, because I want to celebrate, to your point, they're maintaining productivity despite other circumstances in terms of workflow interruptions or volume interruptions or what have you. Or maybe I've asked them to take on double the capacity than normal, and they've been able to maintain at a certain standard, right? What about a scenario where maybe I didn't achieve 100% attainment but I achieved 80% attainment? Should I still reward or recognize that?
Yeah, I think, it's all about communication and engagement when you're going through the point of a crisis, right? Which is, you naturally see absenteeism, you see higher volumes of turnover, you start to see volumes either reduce or volumes increase, but everybody's trying to still hit the same productivity levels because the requirements to produce the product haven't changed. The quality requirements haven't changed.
Sure.
My customers' requirements on that quality hasn't changed.
changed.
Right? The requirements to still run a cost-effective business hasn't changed. Right? Those are still processes that still need to be completed. So when I think about your question is, I was at 100%, now I'm at 80%, and then how do we deal with that? We still have to be on the proactive side and out there on the floor proactively engaging, managing our operations, okay? You get into panic and fears when you're in reactive mode and you have a fire start here, fire start here, fire start here. Now I go put this one out, but this one, I've come over here to attack this one, and this one starts right back up again.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
So as a frontline supervisor, manager, general manager, or someone that's in charge of people or supervises individuals, I have to be on the proactive piece of this on how do I communicate what I want, how do I engage the employees on what's needed so we can make sure that we're still hitting targeted goals every day, even though we have the midst of this crisis and panic going on around us. I mean, employees are filled with fear, right? I mean, they have fear because they don't know what the outcome is, right? Not on the outcome of productivity, on the outcome of themselves, their families. So what you really have to do is start to motivate them and focus them to hey, we have the crisis going on, we have a pandemic going on, but how do I really start to show that productivity has stayed flat so I can come out there and recognize them? So when they hit 80%, it still allows me to pick up a sheet of paper, go out there and say, hey, we're at 80%. What do you see is going wrong? Okay? And how can I engage you? Because now I'm going to take your mind off of what's happening in the panic, right? And we're really going to get back to focused on what are the things that we need to do to actually effectively hit our productivity numbers. Okay? I'm going to take your mind off of it, even if it's for a brief time.
Yeah, great. And I think it's important not to forget, as we are focusing on amending our policies or protocols to align with the current environment to some extent, and as Sean mentioned, the expectations around overall productivity hasn't changed. There are new hires coming into the business as well, and they are now looking to be acclimated or oriented to a work environment that isn't necessarily normal or standard for your operation. So when we talk about empathy protocols, that also includes evaluating the new hire onboarding and on-the-job training process as well. There may be less resources available for that on-the-job training. The supervisor may be tasked or stretched a bit thinner in terms of their mode or level of engagement with employees. So in those scenarios, can you think of what would change as far as that new hire experience as part of an empathy protocol scenario?
Yeah, I think you're going to see more, as you start talking about the, the new hires and the onboarding of them. It's going to be even more critical now that those folks we're working in team environments, okay? Even when you have the social distancing and we're 6 feet away, right? That doesn't stop Dante from showing me, hey, this is step 1, step 2, step 3. I'm going to move out from the area. Now you move in, and I'm going to watch you do step 1, step 2, step 3, make those observations, critique right there, what can we do to improve, right? And then step in, do it again, and continue that on-the-job training, right? On-the-job training doesn't necessarily mean I have to stand exactly beside you every day. What I'm trying to do is get you to make observations on what I'm doing in the process that's correct, right? Make sure that you understand what it is that it's required to make a first-pass quality throughput product, okay? And then make my observations on you while you're doing that. Okay, so that way I can give you feedback and critique. So as you're new and you're in a new situation that is not really known as the normal.
Sure.
Right. Well, these are the new activities and steps that I need you to do. It's actually better in some retrospects that you have a new employee coming on because they don't have the bad behaviors
Sure.
instilled in them, right?
Sure.
Or the shortcuts that you could do. Now you get to train them and mold them on exactly what the process is that you do have. So I don't look at new, some people will say, oh, it's new hires, there's a ramp up period, there's a learned skill that they have to have. It's actually when a new hire comes in, it's actually a great opportunity because you get to set the stage. When you have an effective management operating system, you get to set the stage on these are the requirements of the job. This is what needs to be done. These are the activities that need to be done. And now I can sit here and make my observations on you. And it's a direct reflection of me as a supervisor or a supervisor manager, just someone that manages people.
Sure.
Right? It's a direct reflection on how well I've communicated and engaged you in the process.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
if you're a new employee and you can't effectively do the activities of the job that's required, well, first I have to look at myself and go, did I actually give you the tools to be successful? Okay.
Great. So when you think about empathy protocols, don't think of it in the context of, oh, I get to get rid of a certain policy or a certain procedure. Some areas are just black and white in the business and you don't have the capacity or the flexibility to make changes. But for those areas where you have some measure of flexibility to consider the employee and their experience, we encourage you to do so. That's what empathy protocols are all about. And then at the right point of time, then you can amend or go back to the standards by which you operated historically. I think that's an important because when we talk about empathy protocols, motivating employees, it's really about understanding what is the intent behind our actions. If we connect to the intent, then typically our decisions, whether it's amendment of policies or procedures, or how do I motivate my employees through certain initiatives, you tend to get a better outcome as a result of that decision. So when we talk about motivating or boosting employee morale, our business leaders come to us and they often say, hey, I don't have more money to throw at this thing. I can't pay higher wages to motivate people. I am, especially in the midst of the crises now, really challenged financially or fiscally in my business. So how do I still implement new initiatives with having these financial constraints? So when we think about that in the context of intent, you can come up with some really creative ideas. And I think we've provided just a few to help you understand how you could really leverage some creativity and consider that intent behind your actions. So I want to focus on reducing anxiety, right? Because you alluded to this earlier. Our employees and many of our business leaders feel a sense of anxiety associated with the unknown. What will happen to my role, my employer, or in my personal life, my health, my safety. So anxiety is a big consideration that sometimes we overlook. But when you think about no cost and low cost initiatives, well, we already spoke about amendment to protocols. When we think about break times, a subtle amendment to a break time can go a long way for an employee. Studies have shown that intermittent breaks are beneficial in reviving our mental capacity and our physical capacity. And when they're out on that production floor and we're holding them to the same productivity standards, if not greater standards, then having an extra 5-minute break paid may go a long way. I didn't increase their pay rate. I didn't have to throw a ton of money at it, but that has a significant impact on, okay, I got an extra 5 minutes to take my breath, refocus, and get out there and do what I need to do.
Yeah, and you see some organizations that do that when, there's 8+ hour work schedule, right?
Absolutely.
They'll add additional breaks to them. When you really talk about the breaks, it's, people who are working 12, 14 hours a day, right? And they're starting to work that overtime that's needed because that productivity or that throughput is still needed out of the facility, right? So they're inherently giving you their hours, they're giving you their time, right?
Yes.
And so I agree with you. I mean, there has to be something there where you're going to allow them to get that additional time in where they can recharge, reset.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I would also say this as well. After we're recharged, reset, we got to come back in, and we still have to engage our process.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's you get fatigue after some amount of time, right? And you're probably better at knowing what that time is than I am. But as you get to that fatigue limit, you also have to know when to go, okay, we are hitting maximum performance and now we're starting to decline.
Absolutely.
When is that point where I go, what I'm getting is not really worth the value anymore?
Yeah.
Okay?
Well said.
So as a supervisor or a manager, I have to understand what's happening to the people out on the floor, okay? And starting to understand that curve where, okay, I'm optimum, I'm getting my costs, my costs are right, my productivity's right. At what level do I start to go, okay, we're no longer getting any more? Because what ends up happening is I take an employee down to 60, 50%. They come back the next day, they show up at 80%.
Sure.
Right? And I start off the day already behind the eight ball, right? And I want to make sure that I at least get my employees back at 100%, so I know that I have a better chance of starting my day the next day at 100% than coming in at 80% and maybe only hitting the target of 60.
Yeah. And that's where you may be required to evaluate our employee work schedules. We may want to revise it where we have a different rotation. We may have a scenario where you have A crew, B crew, C crew. There are different unique approaches to work scheduling, either in volume, in allocation of resources, or in show up or attendance that can have a significant impact, especially when employees have some visibility. You don't want to be in a scenario of panic where you communicate with the employees, I don't know when your day is going to end. I don't know when I'm going to ask you to work overtime. I don't know when I'm going to expect you to work an extra day or 2 days in the week, because that creates a sense of uncertainty, which contributes to anxiety. The more you have some proactive visibility to those expectations, I think the less anxious our employees may feel in the midst of what's going on. So communication, or frequent communication around expectations, is going to be key to that process.
Yeah, I mean, effective communication is, 80, 90% of what we do out there, right? I mean, the better we communicate to our employees, the better outcomes that we're going to have. We know that. That's a given, okay? So, it's all about how do we engage them, how do we facilitate them through a process, right?
Sure.
But also in our communication, specifically right now, is the more communication engagement we have with them, the more fear you actually take away from them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so when you start talking about how do you reduce people's anxiety, you're really talking about how do you reduce their fears.
Yes.
Right? So that's really what you have to do. You have to reduce their fear, okay? Because once you reduce their fear, you actually have the opportunity to start continuing to engage them in the management operating system construct, okay? You want to see a management operating system break down real quick. Don't effectively communicate, and then provide fear into that system as well.
You bet.
And then you're going to see a management operating system that breaks down rather quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you start eliminating those fears and you start getting people into those proactive and engaged behaviors around the systems that we've installed, that's when you can start talking about performance goals, okay? Because people are now they're going to be more susceptible to having that engaged conversation with you around performance goals than they are if, am I going to lose my job? Am I late for work? I'm trying to do everything I can. I'm working 14-hour days. So you have to start to remove those barriers away from them, so that way you can get some more effective productivity out on the floor.
All right.
So.
And I'm glad you raised productivity, because as we know, in many of our clients, volume or performance expectations have increased. All right, so as we talk about reducing anxiety and addressing some other challenges they may be facing, it may not change as far as expectations on performance. But that doesn't mean, if my goal is to improve productivity, there aren't some low cost or no cost ways to do so. And when I think about that, performance goal setting is an important pillar to driving specific performance outcomes. And we've spoke about that before, but at what extent should I revise those performance goals to balance desired outcomes with how my employees are experiencing these changes that are going on around them?
You know what? It's a great example I like to use right now is think about our food and beverage clients, right? Especially ones that have to have USDA inside their facilities, right? And if you've been watching the news, you know, we're actually limited on the amount of USDA people, inspectors that we have.
Sure.
They can go in some of these facilities, and what you've seen is now there's been more placement on the actual organizations and the people in that organization to fulfill those checks and those roles. So what have we asked our people to do, right? We've actually expanded their roles.
Sure.
Okay, so now when I used to show up and my activities were A, B, and C, now they're A, B, C, X, Y, Z. Okay, so when you start really talking about performance goals, okay, you have to get ahead of it where you start to say, okay, individual, as you come into the facility, these are now the new expectations in our current conditions. And, you know, what used to be 20 units per hour, okay, or 20, units per labor hour are now 10 units per labor hour because we've actually added these additional activities to your role and responsibilities, okay? So 20 is no longer the number. You have to make sure that you get ahead of the curve and that you're setting reasonable expectations with people on the floor. You want to go back and talk about reducing anxiety. You want to see an employee get anxiety real quick. Tell them that they have to hit the same numbers, same productivity numbers that they did before with more activities loaded onto them and maybe less people around.
Yeah.
That'll build some anxiety.
You bet.
Okay?
You bet.
So
you bet.
you really have to get ahead of it and go, what is going to be the new norm for now? Okay, let's call it temporary, right?
Sure.
Until we get back to we're fully staffed back up. We understand that these activities have gone back to where they were. We don't have to expand that work out to other people, right? It's come back. Now we understand what our true roles and responsibilities. They're back to normal, whatever you want to call normal. And now we can get back to our 20 units per labor hour.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm hoping as you are beginning to hear some of our recommendations, just making the connection between understanding the intent behind the morale boost incentive and the actions that are being taken. When you think about other examples, encouraging creativity, right? There are subtleties in these ideas that have a significant impact. So just a couple of ideas around that. Employee experience, idea box, right? Something so subtle to set a box out and encourage your employees, especially now, to write a few ideas down, drop it in. Now, the caveat to that is, if you're going to have an idea box out, you better be sure that you have a process and a mechanism around reviewing those ideas and getting some feedback. So some feedback loop around those ideas, even if you can't implement them all, but you want the employees to know that their voice is being heard. A subtle incentive or initiative with a significant impact on morale. Keeping in mind, morale is more about their experience, their feelings, their perceptions. So the more that you can consider the intent behind your actions, the more you'll get the desired outcome. Just some other examples of intent in comparison to initiative, showing appreciation. There's subtleties in that, especially now. We've seen all over the news where our frontline responders, whether it's nurses, food processors, what have you, lunch is being purchased for them. Right? That has gone a long way in boosting an employee's morale to know that their leaders and the community cares about the work that they're doing, so much so that here's a meal on us, right? Those subtle programs go a long way in boosting morale. Things like personalized thank you letters or messages. I heard one of our clients suggest something that they call the fish bowl of encouragement, right? It's a simple glass bowl sitting in some key areas of the operation that employees pass every day where they can draw out a statement from key leaders of the business that says, thank you for what you're doing. Keep it up. We appreciate it. Those subtleties that have zero cost or limited cost have a significant impact on your culture as it relates to morale. So remember, intent, action, will lead to positive results.
Yeah, so I will say something. When you really start talking about communication, like during this, okay, when you're talking about no cost, low cost company initiatives, the town halls in which you have. They don't have to be full town halls.
Sure.
Right? You don't have to have everybody come into a room because right now you can't even do that. But you do, as a leader, need to make sure that you're going out and you're effectively communicating with groups of people, or at least coming up and speaking to them individually, right? Because as the town hall, that's going to be the opportunity for you to recognize people, at least in smaller groups.
Sure.
Right? Like, hey, Jane Smith came up with this idea. It's really good. This is how we're going to get it implemented, and start to use those scenarios so people understand that they have a voice into the improvements that's being made even during the crisis. Because what you find out during crisis and panic and plants start to, or facilities start to lose labor, right? You start to see, it goes back to our conversation in part one about what are the activities that are value added versus non-value added.
Absolutely.
And people are really gonna start raising their hand and saying, this is a non-value added activity. So we need to make sure that we're still providing recognition for the improvements that are being made. Because as you come up and you come out of this, you're gonna find a lot of the activities that were once there may not be true requirements of the activities really needed.
Well said, well said. So to transition, when we think about, okay, we've looked at mechanisms to drive productivity, improve morale. There's been this theme, and it's all about leadership engagement. Without leadership engagement, much of what we're talking about is difficult to accomplish, if not impossible, right? So when we look at best practices to increase employee productivity by way of leadership engagement, one way to look at it is through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, I'll spare you the psychology lesson on Abraham Maslow, but I'll tell you that the premise behind the theory says no matter who you are, no matter what background that you may have, there are some fundamental pillars to you being driven to act, to respond, to do, okay? And those fundamental pillars of motivation really begin with survival. Then once you have a sense of survival and the mechanisms in your life that produce survival for you, then you start to progress into, now that I have survival, I need security or a sense of feeling secure. And then once I feel a sense of security, I want to feel a sense of belonging. And once I have a sense of belonging, I want to feel important in my environment or in my community, whether it's family or workplace. And once I feel important and belonged and secure and I feel my foundation is stable, I reach a state of what they call self-actualization. Now, the reality is we can tie those same principles of human motivation to leadership engagement. And when we talk about this, Sean, I think it's important to acknowledge that it would be wonderful if all of our employees had the same level of engagement.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We all know that different employees have different levels of engagement. And the question then becomes, and we talked about this in our previous webinars and even in our videos, if you believe and see yourself as a leader, then you have a responsibility to respond to each individual regardless of their level of engagement. And sometimes what we find is leaders tend to shift to the more highly engaged employees, and then they become overburdensome on the people who they seem or see as their right hand or their go-to. Instead of looking at best practices to figure out how do I address the disengaged and the not engaged just as much as I can highly engaged. So I want to talk about some of those best practices with you, Sean, because I think that's where we start getting into the crux of leadership engagement.
Yeah, and then I think, a good piece of that, going on what you were saying, you got the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? But when you think about it from a leadership standpoint, how do you engage in that standpoint, right? Which is, if I have a new employee on board, where are they at just in their life in general?
No
right?
doubt,
When we
no
start
doubt.
talking about removing people's anxieties, do I have a job?
Sure.
Can I pay for clothes, food, those types of scenarios. So when you start talking about engagement as a frontline supervisor, I always think about, and even how we manage our own people inside our own business is I'm trying to find out as much as I can know about that individual, right? So that's not only professionally, but personally too, because what happens outside comes inside.
Absolutely.
And why I say that is because what experience happens on the outside of the workplace always comes inside the workplace. So what I'm trying to do is really foster a culture within my team, my area, my organization that allows me to be able to have touch points on people and truly understand where it is they are, where do they want to go, and how can we get them there. Okay? And when we talk about that, I'll come 50% of the way, but you got to come the other 50%, right? And that's really, I think, how you get to true self-actualization is because then at that point you feel fulfilled on what you think that you wanted and what you desire as a need that you want.
Yes, right? yes. Great point. So when we think about it in that construct, let's start with the disengaged, right? Because we tend to focus on the high engaged. I want to start with the disengaged. How do I take that employee who, frankly, I'm counting on the measure of productivity I can get out of them, despite their level of disengagement? So as a leader, that looks something a little different than how you how you approach a highly engaged employee. For a disengaged employee, it's really about clarifying and establishing expectations around their performance. But you have to go a bit further with the disengaged employee, because the disengaged employee requires not only clarity and possibly even documentation, but they typically are considered underperforming in their role, and therefore you want to put them on a plan to go from where they are in their performance to where you desire them to be. So that may look like a performance improvement plan, just a notice around their performance where you sit down with them and you actually capture the specific actions they should take in order to improve. But for a disengaged employee, the worst thing you can do is avoid them. You want to address them directly, set those expectations, hold them accountable for those performance outcomes. So a disengaged employee requires actually a bit more of your attention in terms of clarifying their performance expectations, because they're in survival mode. I'm here because I got to pay my bills. I get a paycheck every week or every 2 weeks, and I don't care about doing much more than that. But it's up for you as a leader to clarify your expectations are that they are a value-added contributor, and this is what that looks like. And here are the standards of what it looks like to be a value-added contributor. And if you don't meet those expectations, here are the consequences of it. So engaging that employee in that manner is going to be critical to their success.
Yeah, so I'll take that a little step further. Is that I work with a lot of frontline supervisors, right? Work with a lot of managers, and I will tell you, when I start to hear, we have disengaged employees, the first thing I look at is them.
Sure.
Right? And I go, well, what are you doing to improve the engagement of that employee, right? And engagement is a large topic, and there's a lot of pillars that go inside the word engagement, right?
Absolutely.
And so my first step is, okay, let me look at the individual who's telling me that they have so many disengaged employees, because I want to know why that is. Why is that possible? How is that possible? Because what we do know is about 90% of people, 95% of people show up to work because they want to do a good job.
Absolutely.
They want to do the right thing. They want to have the right performance results. So you have to really start looking at who's managing them to go, okay, wait a minute. Maybe the issue isn't in the employee. Maybe the issue is in their direct supervisor. Okay? I've also worked with employees where they go, hey, if I pull that individual and I take, your route where I have to pull them aside, I have to document it, I have to list it, you hear the common comeback is, it'll take too much time. It takes 5 minutes, it takes 10 minutes, I'll have to pull them off the line, we'll slow down the rate of the line. What I can tell you, though, is when you do have a disengaged employee and they don't feel like that they're part of the process and they're part of the solution,
absolutely,
every day they're gonna pull down the performance of that line.
Absolutely.
So when you really think about it, taking them off to the side, okay, or bringing them into an office and having an in-depth conversation with them on what do we need to ensure that we engage you in the process, and how do you fit in that process so you can be successful.
Absolutely.
that's really what's going to increase your numbers. If you're not willing to take that time out and do that, think about all the 10, 15 minutes every day that come
Exactly.
over and over and over again, that it's actually bringing the productivity down.
Exactly. Well said.
Okay.
Well said.
So
Now we have a question.
Yeah, Stephen asks, can do or can't do analysis helps find out the underlying cause. What are your comments or thought about that?
So when you talk about can do, can't do, will do, won't do, that's a methodology that you can apply to truly understand where they are in their level of disengagement. Is it simply because they don't have the tools or the resources or the understanding to achieve that performance outcome? So in that scenario, they can do it, but they require further resources to get it done. Then you have a scenario where if they're equipped with those resources, they also show a willingness to do it. Those are the individuals who you want to invest more time in. You have some scenarios where they can't do something, but they're willing to do it, right? If they can't do it, but they're willing to do it, then is it a training or a development opportunity there, and how do we leverage that? You have some scenarios where I can do it, but I won't do it, right? And that's where we have to get into clarifying expectations and ensuring that the won't do it scenarios can either be overcome or they may not be a good fit for your operation. So that's where you start to have those more critical conversations. But you're absolutely right, Steve. Leveraging a methodology of assessment. Can they do it or can't they do it? First clarify, and do they have the will to do it or not? And once you have some clarity around there, it does help in that assessment and that dialogue with them in terms of engagement and what do we need to help move us from where we are now to where we need to be. So great point, Steve. Any thoughts around that?
yeah, I think people come into organizations with a preset set of skills, right?
Sure.
And what you're trying to really do is you form your organization and you're putting the champion team together, right? Like our Chicago Bulls or New York Yankees, championship teams of the past, right? Well, it's about putting the right people in the right spots.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
But you have to understand what those skills are, okay? So I always think about, the 2x2 matrix of will do, can't do, won't do, can do. But what you're really trying to do is first you have to put the people in the right spots, right?
Yeah.
Which means, did we find the right position in the organization for them to be successful in? You can also, if you've ever watched that matrix and if you know much about it, people can actually move
Absolutely.
through that matrix too, based on where their position is, right?
Yeah.
So I have seen, will do's, can do's, right? I've seen them move to, will do, won't do's.
As a result of disengagement.
A result of disengagement. A B is not the right position. So what happens is they start to facilitate disengagement with the work that they're doing.
You bet.
And so that starts to put a crutch on the organization because we have people in the wrong spots, right? So we can never just sit back and just go, oh, this is the only position that's available to them and fill. Our job as frontline leaders, right, or any leader in an organization is who is the right person to fill the right role, okay? And as we do that, that's how we start to build championship teams.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. So when we think about some other best practices that you can apply to improve productivity or performance through leadership engagement, when you have that employee who's sort of almost engaged, in those scenarios, they want a sense of belonging. So, and you want to look at specifying specific productivity targets, coordinating some sort of contest, validating the contribution that they're making and how, if they continue to improve in that contribution, they are a critical member of the team and performance outcomes as a team. Typically, those individuals are right on the cusp, and you want to foster that sense of belonging that they're looking for in that scenario, which is a bit different than when you start to get into an engaged employee, because at that point, you're getting what you possibly may want from them from a productivity standpoint, but they believe they can add more value to the process or to outcomes. They have a desire to feel important to the business and the outcomes. So in that scenario, as a leader, I may look at them for guidance, feedback. What do you recommend we do differently on this line to improve capacity utilization? Or how do you think we can improve our productivity considering we are short one or two people? Engage them in that feedback regarding performance barriers and outcomes. You know, when you have a root cause analysis expectation, in those scenarios, you want to engage them in the root cause analysis process. You know, as supervisors or managers, the more that we can look to take an engaged person to a highly engaged, you really have to focus on reassuring their importance to the process. Now let's talk about highly engaged, because that's the fun one, right? Because at that point, okay, we see them as achieving that state of self-actualization. They understand their value. They understand their contribution. That doesn't mean as a leader we don't still have an obligation to foster their development and their focus around productivity. But for a highly engaged person, it's not about micromanagement. It's really about encouraging them to take ownership and accountability to processes. That's where you start getting into concepts around delegation of responsibilities. You start getting into how do they take on more of a team lead type role. Maybe they support some training of a new hire, things of that nature. So you want to understand where people are in their phase of engagement within the process as a result of what you're doing as a leader. Any other thoughts around that, Sean?
Yeah, I would tell you that highly engaged people need as much communication,
Absolutely,
engagement, involvement
absolutely,
as the least engaged person.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just because it's your top performing employee,
Yes.
okay, doesn't mean that you get to not go and talk to them, communicate with them, talk to them about performance, talk to them about improvements that can be done on the line.
Yeah.
The same conversations you would have with a disengaged employee. The construct looks different,
Yeah.
right? But still the engagement and the communication and the two-way that you have back and forth with your employees has to be just as much with the top performer as it is the least performer.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
As we talk about that, I was just thinking about some of the questions from last week that we wanted to get into. And we're not going to have time to go through them all, but we will touch on one or two of them.
Sure.
But I think a good one from last week, as we discussed that, is the same challenges keep popping up. Even after we believe we have applied a solution to the process, what if the problem related to a person and not the process?
Good question.
So that actually falls quite in line with this.
We spoke about this culture of blame versus culture of accountability, and we did talk about how you want to see individuals as potential solutions to barriers versus the person being the problem. And I think from this question, it suggests, what if I've attempted that mindset or that approach, and I am having an individual or person-specific performance issue? And I think that goes back to what we've spoken about around leadership engagement, communication, and setting clear expectations. At the end of the day, we're all here to fulfill a role and a responsibility in the workplace. And we owe it to our employee to clarify those expectations, validate their understanding of those expectations, provide them the tools and resources to be successful. Then it's up to them to then take those tools and resources and fulfill their obligation, or what they own or are accountable to. So in that scenario, at the end of the day, if you've done all you can to engage them, to address the barrier to their performance, empower them, give them the resources they need, and they still aren't meeting those expectations, then that's when you'll progress through whatever corrective steps you have outlined in your organization. Because yes, there are those times as leaders where we have to make those hard decisions, and if that means that an individual is a part of the challenge, it comes down to their performance, then you have to have those hard conversations. Any other thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes, I agree with you. And I think that, when we talk about fit, right?
Yeah.
What's the right fit?
Yeah.
I mean, not everybody is the right fit.
Yeah.
Not every person is in the right spot at the right time, or even in the right organization.
Sure.
Right, and I say that because those are the facts. Okay, I mean, for everybody watching, I mean, that's the truth and honesty that you get. That not everybody is in the right organization.
Correct.
And you probably have processes that you go through, and if you're assessing performance with the right criteria, and you're moving and you really are trying to engage the person themselves, and you just find yourself hitting barriers and roadblocks as you move through that process. I think what you'll end up finding is that it's just not the right person for the right fit.
Yeah,
it doesn't mean that individual is bad.
Sure.
Right? They could probably be successful in another organization.
Sure.
Right? So let's give them the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
So if this is not what they want and the criteria that they want, let's find them the right role and let's help them move into that and move their career on.
Yeah, well said.
Okay?
So do we have another time for another question? Let's
I
see.
think we have one more.
Okay, great. Well, I see here that my manager often says I am not showing enough urgency despite the fact that I get the job done. How do I overcome this perception? Great question. When we think about how we manage what's urgent versus what's not urgent, what's important, what's not important, how does an individual begin to manage their manager's perception of their sense of urgency, even when they feel like they're getting the job done?
Yeah, it's the old theory of management, right? You have to manage up, you have to manage down, and you have to manage side to side, right? And that can be a sticky situation, right? Your boss is telling you that they want an action done, they want it quicker, faster. You're not showing enough urgency, right? What your job is to do, though, as an individual, is to build the management construct. So if they believe that you're not showing enough urgency, if you're in the process of building your management operating system and it's going to be effective, you have to include them into your plans on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. Because if you haven't effectively communicated on what it is that you're trying to get initiated or completed, maybe it's out on the floor, maybe it's in my area, maybe it's in my office setting, right? Now, if you haven't included them in there, we go back to our part 2, which is, I don't think you've got enough workload on you, so I'm going to give you workload.
That's right. That's right.
So you have to really start to build out the construct and get them involved so they start to understand where you are in your process. How's it coming along? So that way they can understand where they need to insert themselves and provide help and that sense of urgency on things to get done. Because it may not just be a sense of urgency on you individually, it may be a sense of urgency that they need to go apply on some other resources in the area to help you. Okay? So.
Well said. Well said. Well, many of the other questions we received, we'll be sure to provide some responses on some of our other platforms. So look out for those responses to questions we've received over the course of the last 3 series. We also encourage you, if you haven't already asked a question in this series and something pops up, reach out to us. We have our contact information on our website, and we welcome the opportunity to further this dialogue or the questions, or address the questions you may have.
Yeah, that's great. So, if you would like to see the recording of this video, you can go to www.thepowerscompany.com/webinars, and you can see the 3-part series that we have up. You can also follow us on LinkedIn at Powers. You can also see our YouTube videos as well, where we have our Power Your Productivity series going on, where it helps to actually help you build and construct your own management operating system in your area. And we have a Power Your Culture series, which allows you how do you effectively engage and communicate and build the culture that you want around your management operating system to get the right results. So thank you again for joining us for our 3-part webinar series on Panic is Not a Strategy, and go out there and power up.